Hello, hello. How are we doing? We are multi-streaming for the first time on Twitch as well as on Facebook. Let me just check that's working. I actually can't tell if that's working. Right, let me, give me a second here. Somebody shout in the chat if I'm on anywhere. Alright, looks like YouTube is working at least. I don't know if Twitch is working. I guess it's not. I had some real problems setting that up. I don't know if it's just me, my browser not liking watching Twitch. Alright, well maybe we're on Twitch. Anyways, we're on YouTube at least. YouTube's working nice. Thank you. Good to see you, Brian. We've got a good Earthling Ed interview to watch. I enjoyed watching the Edie Bowles interview the other day. I can't stop calling her Bowles. You know what, we're meant to be also on Facebook, so we'll see if we're there. But in any case, we are on YouTube, so let's get into it. We're going to do a little bit of Fast Action Network. First of all, if you don't know, this is action.thehumaneleague.org. And this is your platform for very easy, coordinated online activism. We'll see how easy it is. Look at this. I get a feed, I can click through to the links, and here we're commenting on Unilever's LinkedIn posts. We'll do a few of these before we get into it, guys. Done. We get 1 point. All right, we're going to do up to, time to go to 400 points. Let's go to 400 points. We're going to break 400 today, lads. Oh, hey, here's my Facebook. Am I live on here? Hell yeah, I am. Wonder if we get any viewers over there. Maybe my mum. Hey, mum. Right, let's do a few of these. Sometimes it doesn't let you do the contact forms. I think we're good. I've been blocked by some of these before. I've got a message to copy. Yeah, some of the American brands have blocked my IP address. I don't know if they block any feedback from outside the US, or if they've specifically blocked me because I've done this kind of stuff before. They know we're trouble. This is action.thehumaneleague.org. All right, up to 390. We're going to do up to 400 points here. And then we'll watch some Earthling Ed. Contact forms, always be doxing my details. $3.93 postcard, we're not doing that. Facebook, you don't get any points, but we still do them. Earl's Restaurants, what brand is this? Huh, this must be a new one. I don't think we've done any Earl's Restaurants yet. But there you go, they can have some complaints. The email one brings up my email program, my Outlook. Another contact form. Right, we're up to 396. We're nearly there, guys. Head on over. This relies on a lot of people doing it, so join in if you haven't already. We are letting them know what we think at companies who have bailed on their cage-free commitments. Wow, I only need to be over 13 to do it on here. Right, last one. Stop and Shop. We know about Stop and Shop. Boom, 400 points. Very nice. And we're done. You know what, let's give this a quick read. This is only a shorty. We're going to read Sandcastles real quick, and then we'll get into the Earthling Ed video. It's too tempting a title to ignore. 3 soul-meltingly hot takes for animal activists in 2026. I've heard from a few people who enjoy this newsletter, but I've heard from many more who say, WTF man, I can't read a 10,000 word post every week. To the latter group, who apparently don't care about animals very much, I say this post is for you. I think I even gave it a clickbaity title and everything. Damn, called out. So gather round, children, and let old Uncle Sandcastles tell you what's going to happen in 2026. Hot takes. AI will be accelerating so hard that no animal activist can ignore it. Wait, sorry, that describes 2025. Or at least I think it should. Yet my latest post about AI and animal advocacy still got a few replies from intelligent people, no less, claiming AI progress has run into a wall or is about to do so. I think this perspective is badly wrong, but only time will tell, so I'm registering my predictions that the METR task length chart will track a 4 or 5 month doubling time, or faster, throughout 2026, one proxy for capabilities improvement continuing exponentially. Okay. Is this not getting longer? Am I reading this right? Performance in terms of the length of tasks AI agents can complete. Oh, I see, okay. So it's not that they take this long to do a given task, but they can do tasks that do take this long. Okay, well that's pretty immense. So this is logarithmic scale, so this is about, what, 5 hours, something like this? 6.5 hours, the latest one. Well, that's crazy, to be fair. There'll be signs AI is taking a bite out of US employment, especially in white-collar sectors, though alternative explanations will abound. Yeah, I think that there already are some signs that AI is taking a bite out of employment. I believe that's right. There'll be nothing like a bubble-bursting event, despite an ever greater share of the stock market and GDP growth hinging on AI investments. That's an interesting one. I mean, I'm inclined to say there is a bit of an AI investment bubble. But what do I know, really? I mean, that's kind of just based on vibes and things I've heard other people saying, but I'm no expert, so maybe we'll see. Number 2, getting cancelled is over. Interesting. Cancel culture is so last decade. Kind of true. It's 2026. Nobody is cancelled anymore. Anyone who was previously cancelled is officially uncancelled, and nobody new is getting cancelled. People will keep trying to cancel each other, but it's not going to work anymore because the rest of us have had enough. We're not going to ostracize our friends because other people weren't interested in resolving their conflicts constructively. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What does cancelling really mean? Once you realize it's kind of fine if some people are mad at you, then that's that, I guess. There are broader things where people get sacked or ostracized in other ways, which I guess still can happen if the behavior is bad enough. But I suppose the idea is that the culture of assuming that everybody is on board with, saying that somebody is socially cancelled for minor infractions, yeah, that does kind of feel over. But of course, people can associate with whoever they want to, and in all cases, there's going to be some behaviour which is deemed over the line, and some amount of people are going to quote-unquote cancel you. But yeah, I mean, the broader thing of cancel culture does feel kind of passé at this point. Number 3, the animal movement will focus on winning. We've got the Trump meme here. Various old factional disputes in animal activism will all finally be seen for the smoke and mirrors they always were. I'm talking about grassroots versus professional, welfarist versus abolitionist, radical versus moderate, pragmatic versus idealist, veganism versus reducitarianism/offsets. Yeah, I mean, I hope that's true. I have said before that I think a lot of these divides are artificial. Like, I always talk about the welfarist versus abolitionist, right? Again, this is kind of passé at this point. But it does feel like a lot of these divides are made up in order to create infighting in the movement. And this would be a great strategy of our opponents in the animal industries. Right, let's try to get the animal advocates fighting with each other so that they're not focusing on doing anything productive. Now, as one of this person's later blog posts will say, there are some constructive forms of infighting. Politely and kindly arguing with each other about the best strategies for advancing the animal cause is an example of constructive infighting. And I think that is a good thing, and we have seen a bit of that since this post was written. Now, there are obviously destructive forms of infighting as well, where people are excluded from others' resources and teams, and, not allowed to contribute because of kind of minor differences, or even what appear to be major differences, right, on different philosophical points. I think that we can just constructively focus on the areas where we do agree. And although there has been, and will continue to be, some of this kind of infighting, I think that it's clear to me that there are some key things that people should agree on if they're interested in advancing the animal cause. And that's, a constructive place that we can go from. A new faction will emerge to take their place, Team Winning. This faction will natively understand the synergy between many different forms of winning. As a result, Team Winning will spend much less time criticising each other, freeing up all that energy to focus on, you guessed it, winning. We'll win so much, we'll get tired of winning. By the end of 2026, we'll say, please, enough, no more winning. And we'll even start to feel pity for the factory farm industry. Okay, it's too spicy. Here's some cashew sour cream. You've now been warned, so if you get caught off guard by these wonderful developments, you'll only have yourself to blame. Here's what you could do instead of that to prepare for a great year of animal activism. Build your first AI automation. Go start a conversation right now with Claude using the following prompt. This is a great shout, by the way. If anybody's watching who does work in animal advocacy or adjacent fields, or even if you're somebody who works in an unrelated field and you want to advance your career more quickly and have more money to give to effective animal charities, right? You've got to be up on automations. Hey Claude, I've been wanting to become more savvy about using AI and LLMs lately. One idea I had was to try to automate some components of my work using Claude Code, N8N, or Zapier. But I don't know where to start. I'd like to ask for your help. Could you interview me about my weekly work rhythms, identify one or more tasks that I could save time by automating, and then help me build automations? Assume I'm a total beginner with all this stuff and walk me through it step by step. I'm excited to work with you on this. Yeah, I think this is a really good idea. I'm going to put the link to this blog in chat, by the way. If I do that, does it just go to YouTube chat? I think so. All right, let's do it like that. Yeah, as much as you can automate, I mean, you're going to be more efficient at work, you're going to get more done. If you're working in animal organizations or protein organizations, this seems to be especially important. And indeed, if you're giving to these organizations, then increasing your career capital by getting into automations and increasing your efficiency by implementing automations is going to be a good thing. Read my previous AI posts, then start following some of the recommended podcasts or newsletters if you really want to stay caught up on the AI news. Get off the cancel train. It's just going to make you look silly at this point. In fact, if you have any old friends you stopped talking to because they were being publicly shamed, 2026 is a great year to reach out and welcome them back into the movement. Go get maniacally obsessed with winning a campaign. Almost any campaign, it doesn't matter. I haven't yet seen anyone in the movement come close to meeting the burden of proof. I'd need to be convinced that any pro-animal campaign has been net negative. From the most welfarist/incremental campaign to campaigns against those very welfare schemes. Though I'm on the record saying campaigns for non-farmed animals won't do much to end factory farming, even that is a far cry from net negative. To summarise all that, 2026 will be a great year to stop focusing on things that don't matter and focus on what matters instead, and therefore a great year to build more sandcastles. Well, we like this blog. That was a nice, some nice hot takes for the year. All right, we'll do one little. Nah. I'll leave that for another time. Let's watch Earthling yet. Let's watch Earthling. Try and stay away from the LinkedIn drama this time, okay? But I've been recommended this interview. We enjoyed the Edie Bowles interview, and this is with a journalist for DSmog who has been looking into the meat culture wars and who is orchestrating that. All right, let's go.
Thank you so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. Just a reminder that my third book, How to Go and Stay Vegan, is now available to pre-order. So if you're not yet vegan, but you want to make the change, well, this book is perfect for you because it breaks that change down, simplifies it right down, and will make it easier and more straightforward for you. Maybe you're a vegan, but you have a non-vegan friend, family member, loved one, someone who has expressed an interest in going vegan. Maybe someone who is doing veganuary or needs a friendly push in that direction. Well, this book is the perfect Christmas gift or veganuary present for that person. And maybe you're a vegan. Well, this book is not just about how to go vegan. It's about how to be vegan, how to exist as a vegan in a non-vegan world. So I discuss some of those emotional complexities, and I discuss how we can overcome them so that we can better exist as vegans. Fundamentally, this book is not just about making going vegan easier. It's about making being vegan easier. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, well, you can pre-order the book by going to the description where I have links to do so, or you can scan the QR code now. And if you do pre-order, well, thank you so much. Pre-ordering makes such a huge difference, and I really do appreciate it. Also, you can now find me over on Substack, where I'm posting weekly articles, and you can sign up to become a free member, or you can sign up and support my work by becoming a paid member, through which you'll also gain access to all of the articles that I post over on Substack. All right, thank you so much for listening, and I really hope that you enjoy this video. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Disclosure Podcast. On today's episode, I am delighted to be joined by Claire Carlile. Claire Carlile is a journalist who focuses on environmental and social issues. She is currently an investigative reporter for the award-winning environmental news outlet DSMOG. Claire has a BA in English Literature and Languages from the University of Oxford, and before her work at DSMOG, she was co-editor at the Ethical Consumer magazine, where she specialised in migrant workers' rights. Claire's current work at DSMOG often focuses on agribusiness and food politics, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and Claire's investigations have been covered by media outlets including The Guardian, The Financial Times, and Politico. So Claire, thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast. I would love to start with looking at the Eat Lancet report, and more importantly, the conversation around the Eat Lancet report. So I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about the report and about your investigation into Red Flag and who Red Flag are.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess for anyone who doesn't know of the Eat Lancet report, basically back, 5 or so years ago now, in 2019, a group of academics put out this report. And at the time it was really groundbreaking. It was the first time anyone had tried to look at how to feed the world sustainably with an increasing population, and kind of what impact that could also have on health and life expectancies. So it was this massive piece of work. It took several years. I think it was 37 academics from lots of different disciplines. When it came out, there was this crazy backlash online, a huge culture war around it. Which I think really took people aback. And it focused on one kind of specific recommendation, which was cutting meat consumption. So the report said that particularly in kind of high income countries, people should be transitioning to more beans and pulses, still some meat, some fish, but a big cut in particularly red meat consumption and sugar consumption as well. And there was this, enormous backlash. And basically what we found, we got access to a document that indicates that a lot of this, some of it was obviously organic, but kind of quite a lot of this backlash was stoked, at least, by a PR firm that regularly represents the meat and dairy industry. So that PR firm is Red Flag, as you said. And, this document was an evaluation written by Red Flag of the campaign they did against Eat Lancet. And it shows that, they briefed journalists, they briefed think tanks, they spoke to social media influencers. They tried to frame what was peer-reviewed research as kind of radical, out of touch, hypocritical. Those were their key catchphrases. And they were really, really successful. This evaluation is actually them kind of boasting about the success of their campaign against the report. Part of what they did was, in my view, was really distract from the science.
Yeah.
one of the main kind of messages that they were trying to get across was around this woman called Gunhild Stordaland. So she is the founder of EAT, which is an environmental organisation, and EAT had funded some of the research and had initiated the process, but the research was done by academics. It wasn't done by this woman, Gunhild Stordaland. But they seeded, I mean, I think it was over 100 articles that in the end focused on Gunhild Stordaland. You know, the fact that she flew in a private jet, the fact that her husband was pictured eating burgers, and they used this to suggest that the research as a whole was kind of hypocritical. So just
obviously this is, I mean, this goes without saying, this is so irrelevant to the findings of the research, right? The research could be done by someone who's an absolute bastard or funded by someone who's an absolute bastard, which is also not necessarily the case of someone's flying a private jet. And still, yeah, the research can still be completely accurate. So she's going to go on to talk about this. I love that the PR firm is called Red Flag. This is, you couldn't make that up, could you? This is also one of those things where, although it was exposed and the PR firm was uncovered and were criticised for this campaign, infuriatingly, this is probably good for their business, because it was their job to seed doubt about the validity of the science in this case. And here was a report, like she said, the report itself was basically boasting about how successful they had been in doing that. But it is fucking evil, though, is it not? Like, imagine your job being make everyone not believe this scientific report about the importance of reducing animal product consumption for maintaining a livable planet. What's actually the end game of somebody who's engaged in that? Do they not want their kids to have a planet to live on? It's so short-sighted.
Just, yeah, totally distracted from the research itself.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think what you've hit on is something really important, which is often when there is this sort of obfuscating of the truth, it's more about trying to tarnish those who are presenting a message as being hypocrites. And the environmental movement faces this all the time. And within animal rights and veganism, we face this as well, which is this sort of accusation that if you do anything that has an impact negatively towards the cause that you're representing, that therefore sort of delegitimizes all of your messaging and all of your arguments. And I get this as a vegan, where people go, oh, well, but what about animals who were killed in this situation? Or what would you do in this hypothetical scenario? And then they kind of use that basis to say, well, all of your arguments are therefore unjustified. And what's interesting about the Eat Lancet thing is, even within the report, they sort of had said, if I'm not mistaken, that, plant-based diets are an option, but for the actual sort of dietary health, diet that they were presenting, it wasn't a necessity from their, academic research. They were saying plant-based diets are an option, but also we were more focused on reducing consumption rather than, say, eliminating it. But even though they're not necessarily saying eliminate it, they're still getting pushback. And it's strange, because it's not that they're anti-meat necessarily. They're just saying that we're eating too much of it. Now, I might personally believe that they should say, let's not eat any of it. But from their academic perspective, they're saying, let's eat less of it. But that's still enough to cause a massive uproar.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think it was interesting. Like, I spoke to a lot of academics who were saying, like, this was really at the starting point of meat becoming quite a culture war. So, yeah, I think it was this shifting point. And, not in any way to suggest that Red Flag was directly behind this, but because there was this massive culture war online, I mean, it had really high costs for the researchers themselves. Like, they started getting really badly attacked online. I spoke to a researcher who said, he was struggling to do any research. He was struggling to put papers out. He feels like his career's still being impacted. They were withdrawing from media interviews where they were supposed to be speaking about the Eat Lancet report. Some of them.
Yeah, that sucks. Because these scientists were bullied by this PR firm and, their army of online minions then. It actually impacted on their ability to do their work, and they were, there's this sort of chilling effect where they're withdrawing from media engagements and so on. which is, you know, part of the point of doing this, right? Part of the point is to seed doubt among the general population and undermine the work. And part of the point is just to actually shut up the people doing this kind of work and prevent them from doing more of the same. So, I mean, I don't really know what's to be done about that, but it's very insidious the way that this campaign worked.
Them kind of stopped using social media altogether. Like, it was really serious stuff. And it wasn't necessarily that Red Flag, it wasn't directly behind that. There's no evidence to suggest that it was. But, you know, it was stoking this culture war, which is making a very hostile environment for scientists to put out, papers on things like meat and dairy reductions.
It's like sort of a right-wing cancel culture in some ways. It's trying to silence academics and journalists often, but, you know, scientists and their work. So Red Flag, they're a PR firm.
Yeah.
And were they sort of hired, let's say, or what was their relationship to Animal Ag? Why did they sort of come on board and decide to try and tarnish the findings of the report?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Well, they were paid, presumably. Be interesting to know if there were any other kind of interests here.
We don't know who funded the work. I mean, it presumably will have had a funder, but everything in the document points towards the fact that they did it either on behalf of or at least in partnership with a group called the Animal Agriculture Alliance, which is, a meat and dairy lobby group. And they were formed, a while ago they say to counter kind of emerging threats for the industry. And when you look at that, it's fighting against everything from kind of meat-free Mondays through to, you know, animal rights activism. Through to the Eat Lancet report. And we saw some minutes of their meetings that said, you know, both Red Flag and the AAA were preparing for this report before it was even published. They hadn't even seen the findings. They just heard that there was a report which, you know, was negative about the meat industry. And they were already briefing journalists. Red Flag was already briefing journalists. The AAA was already preparing its campaigning.
So that's fascinating. So the report hadn't been published, but they got wind that the report was coming out. They didn't know the findings of the report, but they still constructed a campaign to try and attack the report. I mean, that just shows how disingenuous it is if they don't even know what the findings were.
Yeah, totally. And it's really interesting. Red Flag was already working with I don't know if you know the Institute of Economic Affairs. Yeah, libertarian think tank. Very linked to trusts.
Yeah, I feel like I'm familiar with the Animal Agriculture Alliance. Do they do stuff here on LinkedIn yet? Let's see what kind of things they're posting. These will be all my meat industry connections that I've got from various debate challenges and so on. Oh, actually, I guess there's also some plant-based people keeping an eye on what the other side's up to. 16 hours ago, 1 like. 1 day ago, 2 likes. Wow. I'd be paying a PR agency as well.
But they had already briefed the Institute of Economic Affairs and were working with them to brief press beforehand. And the Institute of Economic Affairs was then quoted in so many different media articles saying, like, they're trying to control your diets. They're going to kind of tax you out of being able to do all this different stuff. So again, very culture wars, either like they're trying to control you narrative.
It's fascinating. And I suppose maybe to touch on what we were just saying about the person who was targeted, whose name Gunhild Stordelin. Gunhild Stordelin.
I think that's how you say it.
Yeah, it's right. It's Gunhild Stordelin. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. Is there, I suppose, because of the current political climate and sort of the ravenous appetite of those who are trying to attack this climate science, is there an argument that those within this kind of research and the scientists or the funders, should they also be aware of the optics and how they present themselves? Like, because I guess the criticism, while it shouldn't be viewed as justifiable enough to tarnish the findings of the report, is there an argument that the people within this should also be mindful of how they are traveling or how they are eating, and should they sort of live by example if they're presenting this evidence?
The thing is, if you dig enough, you're always going to be able to find something to criticize people on. What we ideally would need is for people to actually be focused on the relevant things, like actually to engage with the arguments. Notice that none of what they've said, by the way, is actually a refutation of any of the science presented, right? It's like, this person's a hypocrite because they fly on a private jet. They're trying to control what you eat. It's all like just irrelevant ancillary points. None of it is saying, well, here's the actual problem with the science presented in the Lancet, right? It's all, yeah, exactly. She says distraction and undermining and deflection. It's not actually refuting any of the science presented.
It's a really good question. I think...
Which is interesting, because if they could refute the science presented, they would just do that, right? This is why when I'm criticising the Dublin Declaration, for example, I will say, here's why the Dublin Declaration is bollocks. They are specifically doing this stuff where they're misleading and talking about things which aren't really relevant and so on. What I'm not saying is this is all funded by the meat industry, or these people are hypocritical, or other things like this, right? It's actually talking about the substance and the point of what's in the science. But of course, because the science supports reducing animal product consumption, if you're selling animal products and representing the livestock industries, well, you can't really do that. You can't really actually engage with the science. So instead, you just have to talk about all of this ancillary nonsense.
In some ways, one I don't feel that qualified to answer. I guess it's probably just inevitable that you will get targeted with this stuff. But also, I think that there'll always be things that the meat and dairy industry, like, there'll always be things that lobbyists can find, you know.
It also feeds into the idea that this criticism is what we should be focusing on, when actually it's the findings of the report. And, you know, if someone, let's say someone is an outspoken advocate against sweatshops, but they're photographed going into a company that uses sweatshops for their clothing, that might be like a criticism that you could level, but that doesn't mean that all their arguments against sweatshops are wrong.
Yes.
So we need to stop thinking about individuals and personalizing it, and just look at the data and the evidence. What does it show us, and how should that influence sort of wider society, not just necessarily the people involved in that research, let's say.
Yeah, and I feel like that's like the big thing. I guess we'll talk about this more, but like the big thing about misinformation in general is, you know, these, I think particularly around food and farming, like the policy changes that we're talking about are really complicated. Like, it is going to be really complicated to support dietary change, to support farmers to transition away from, some farmers to transition at least away from meat and dairy production. But like, the misinformation is stopping us having the meaningful conversations about why those policies are difficult and how we do them right.
So, I mean, yeah, I think that's right. It's, if we could all get on the same page, and we don't even necessarily have to, I suppose, reach commonality on the whole concept of what would need changing, but if we could all agree that there was change that was needed, and we kind of took away some of these biases, these vested interests, and just sort of, as a society, establish, right, we need to change. Then at least we could start to work out what those changes could look like. You know, what sort of government funding? How do we change subsidies? How do we change farming regulations to help farmers transition? And I think part of the problem is, and we'll talk about this in just a little bit more detail, part of the problem is there's sort of this binary that's emerging where it's maybe environmentalists, it's animal rights activists versus, let's say, farmers versus the livestock industry, when actually there is a lot that we do share in common, which is we want a sustainable food system that can feed people. And we might not agree necessarily what that is, but the average farmer isn't necessarily thinking, oh, I relish in causing harm to animals, I relish in polluting rivers and streams and releasing methane. They just haven't necessarily been given the ability to formulate a sort of a substantiated viewpoint on their industry, because they're being fed misinformation by the lobbyists who represent them, or by the organizations that represent them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. People within the industry are reading the same media as the rest of us, right? And we saw some of this in the FarmKind saga. So yes, people within the livestock industry are, getting high on their own supply of misinformation when they are seeing things which have been put out by livestock industry interests, and then reading them back and thinking, oh yes, this is true, this person associated with Elon flies in a private jet and therefore the whole thing must be bollocks. Somebody is coming up with these talking points very cynically and seeding them, as you said, like, doing the PR thing, sending out to journalists and so on. And as a result of that, the people who are being represented by that PR industry aren't necessarily in on that, right? It's distant, it's done by a PR agency commissioned by a lobbying group, which the lobbying group represents their industry with which they're a part. So there's a few steps removed. Right, it's not that every livestock farmer is in these meetings where there's the moustache-twirling evil lobbyist types. Rather, they are kind of distantly supporting this through levies and however else this whole thing is funded. But then they are reading the same media as the rest of us, and then they are genuinely believing these talking points. So it's really obscuring the ability to see the truth for people outside of the industry, but also for people within the industry.
And these farmers are looking up at these unions, or looking up at these organizations that are meant to be their voice, and they're being deceived. And I think that they're being led down the wrong path by the people who are meant to represent them.
A big one on this is with low welfare imports, which are a bad thing for individual farmers. Right? We were looking at survey data last time showing livestock farmers are the group with the largest, strongest opposition to low welfare imports, because of course it's undercutting them. It's not fair on them. If British farmers adhering to UK animal welfare standards are having to compete with imports which don't have to adhere to UK animal welfare standards, and that is not a good thing. But some of the lobbying groups which represent the international businesses are not going to be aligned with that, and so the lobbying groups which are ostensibly representing farmers sometimes will be speaking directly opposite to particular farmers' interests.
I also think a lot of farmers are very aware, and they're not deceived. Like, obviously, there are farmers, as there are with the general population, who...
And this is because... Sorry to keep interrupting it. This is because... the biggest threat to farming jobs is not, in fact, veganism, vegetarianism, meat reductionism. It's actually factory farms. Right, this is the article on Bryant Research about this point. How big ag distracts farmers and destroys their jobs. Farmers' ire has been misdirected at meat alternatives, which make up less than 2% of the total market for meat and alternatives. The narrative that the rise of veganism and alternative protein sources is to blame for farmer job losses is becoming increasingly prevalent. The real killer of farming jobs is not falling demand for animal products, but intensification. And how do we know this? Well, look at the amount of meat produced, which is aligned up and up and up and up, and the number of agricultural jobs, which is aligned down and down and down and down. Right, if this reduction in farming jobs was being caused by a reduction in demand for animal products, we would see these lines going in the same direction, but that's not what we see. We're producing more meat than ever in the most recent year in this graph, and we have fewer farming jobs than ever. This is the UK, this is the US, this is China, similar story. This is an interesting one. This is Brazil, which was kind of late to the party on industrialization of a lot of farming. So they still had an increasing number of farming jobs up until about 2005, and then it's been steadily down, and now it's at an all-time low. But similarly here, right, rising amount of meat produced. So this is a really good graph to be able to bring up when people are talking about meat reduction and veganism and vegetarianism being responsible for a loss of farming jobs. There are fewer farming jobs, right? We've lost 2/3 of farming jobs since 1960 in the UK. But it's not because we're producing less meat, we're producing more meat than ever. It's because of intensification. So it's the factory farms that are destroying farming jobs. And interestingly, from an animal perspective, from a vegan perspective, it would largely be a good thing if there were more farming jobs, everything else equal, because that would imply that the same amount of meat is being produced over a larger number of more extensive farms. Right, when you see farming jobs going down and meat production going up like this is exactly what intensification looks like and a move towards factory farms. So this is in the UK, right? 2/3 of farming jobs gone and meat production almost doubled in the same time. It's because of the factory farms.
Don't trust the climate science or, are very opposed to the notion of meat and dairy reduction, even though the science points towards that as a necessity, of course. But I also think that there are lots of farmers who are willing to change, but their voices aren't being heard. Like, right. I think people, in my view, it's more, certainly as much, if not more, that people are kind of weaponizing the group within farming as is within the general population that is opposed to this, and they're using that as kind of, in order to make quite populist arguments that make this too divisive to tackle.
I absolutely love what you've just said there. I think that's so true, which is there are voices that are unheard and there are viewpoints that are not presented, perhaps because they're not sensationalist or they're not radical or they're not necessarily going to feed into sort of the clickbait that sort of dominates so much of our media landscape and information landscape. And there are huge numbers, I would sincerely imagine, of farmers who would be open-minded, who are rational, who are interested in what needs to happen, but are not being given access to the ability, let's say, or the support perhaps.
That's the other part of this as well, right? Distracts farmers and destroys their jobs. So these big factory farming industries and companies can't just destroy the farming jobs. They also have to distract the farmers. They have to have some sort of scapegoat, because otherwise the farmers are going to say, hang on a minute, we're not going to be in favour of factory farms. This sucks for us, right? There's fewer farming jobs now. Our farms are all getting undermined by these factory farms. Our farms are getting destroyed because of the fact that there's now factory farms everywhere. Thousands of them are opening up in Europe in the last few years. Right, so the factory farm company can't have that, so they have to have an alternative narrative to prevent, well, it's about the vegans, it's about the vegetarians, it's about the meat alternatives, it's about the Eat Lancet commissioned by someone who flies on private jets. Right, this is all just a distraction from the real cause of the killing of farming jobs. This is a great example. Debate surrounding farmer concerns has been co-opted by large agribusinesses and directed towards meat alternatives. For example, Italy's attempted a pro-farming bill promised to place a countrywide ban on cultivated meat. But cultivated meat has not even been approved for sale yet in Europe, and has displaced precisely zero demand for conventional meat to date. Intensive farms are making life miserable for Europe's farmers, and they're pointing the blame at products which do not yet even exist. It's cynical. It's it's evil.
We'll talk about sort of politics and populism in just a moment, but before we do, let's just thinking about the Lancet report and about red flag. One of the things that's interesting about your investigation is it shows how the animal farming sector will use different tactics to try and spread doubt about the science and to discredit scientific literature. And I think, sort of generally speaking, as a sort of society now, we are somewhat aware, maybe not as much as we need to be, but we are aware, at least I think, that other industries like the tobacco industry or the fossil fuels industry will use a range of tactics to discredit science. Do you think that there is as much awareness around how the animal farming sector uses the same tactics?
Yeah, it's a really good question. No, I don't. I guess it's been a process to build the awareness around kind of the fossil fuel industry, the tobacco industry. I think meat and dairy has flown under the radar for much longer. I mean, maybe its use of the tactics are kind of building now that there's an increasing amount of pressure, an increasing amount of evidence on this stuff. Like, definitely there's been an uptick in the culture war element around meat and dairy since scientists started pointing out that we need to reduce livestock numbers. But yeah, I think it's really under-recognised. And when you look at the tactics, I mean, they are totally parallel. Like, in the US, the meat and dairy industry has given free educational resources to schools. In Southeast Asia, they're working with TikTokers to try and build the dairy market there. There's all sorts of things that we have seen time and time again from the fossil fuel industry. But yeah, I think at the moment it's really under-recognised. I think part of...
Yeah, it's an interesting point. The PR talking points, and by the way, so much stuff that you hear around falls into this category. So many of these stupid talking points about ultra-processed food, that's a big hobby horse of mine, seed oils, right? What's the other one? Methane cycling. This is a big... stupid idea invented by this guy called Frank Mitloehner, who has blocked me on LinkedIn and won't debate me. There's so much in this category which are meat industry PR paid talking points that have come into and become, quite broad and common. Again, it's totally cynical. I'm hoping I think of some more of these as we go along, but a lot of the stuff that you hear around beef tallow, right? All of this stuff about beef tallow that you see so much of now, like where was that 5 years ago? It's a result of the advancing science showing that we need to reduce animal product consumption and production has now provoked the industry into defending itself and putting out and seeding these talking points. And, as you're saying, it's much in the same way as we've seen for the fossil fuels industry and the tobacco industry. And the other thing to say about this is it's completely predictable, right? It's very unsurprising that this is happening. What do you expect from an industry which sees its revenues being threatened? There are a bunch of people who are paid to work for this industry. There's a bunch of people with large investments in this industry, right? Of course, they're going to think that it's worthwhile and frankly have no qualms with paying to put out disinformation on these points, paying to confuse the public conversation and ensure that they continue to make money. It's a lot of people on our side, I think, are not nearly cynical enough about this stuff. It's on one level shocking that this kind of thing goes on, but on another level it's entirely predictable. And we shouldn't be shocked in some sense, right? It's like, what would you expect these industries to be doing? They're just going to take it? No, they're going to spend some of that money trying to defend themselves and elongate their lives. And exactly as she points out, you see exactly the same thing with the fossil fuels industry, exactly the same thing with the tobacco industry. It's entirely unsurprising. So, there shouldn't be anyone who doubts at this point that there are just out and out lies which are being pushed by people paid by meat industry lobbies.
The reason for this as well is I guess it took a long time for the education around why fossil fuels are a problem to get into the general kind of public sphere in order for people to be able to recognise these dodgy tactics or recognise the misinformation, whatever. I think there still is much less understanding of the role that meat and dairy plays, and therefore we're much less well equipped to kind of spot that seems like really dodgy science, that seems really misleading, that's only part of the picture.
That's interesting. I feel the same. I feel like even within the environmental movement, people who are more savvy to some of the tactics, I still find that there is not as much awareness around how the meat and dairy and egg industries are using these tactics and obfuscating the truth and sort of being very disingenuous in terms of how they're sort of presenting their own industry. And I wonder if from a consumer perspective, if because we have a lot more of a tie to the food we consume, people are obviously opinionated when it comes to fossil fuels, and we do have sort of political leanings one way or the other that might inform our views on them. But I think with food, what's quite interesting is it's so deeply intertwined with our identities. It's to do with culture and society, and it's to do with our families and festivities like Christmas and Easter or whatever it may be. That food sort of represents something that in our lives has a slightly higher value to us personally than, let's say, maybe some of these other things. My view is that maybe makes us more receptive to misinformation because it feeds maybe into sort of confirmation bias. Do you agree with that? Do you think that's maybe simplistic, or do you think that perhaps that sort of extra tie to...
Hey Po, good to see you. Welcome. Yeah, we're doing an early one today.
The food does make it a little bit harder for people to see the clarity in this misinformation.
No, I definitely agree with that. I do think that's true. I mean, I think that's also something that you like see being weaponized, you know, like, for example, I think it's amazing how much of the culture war around food is around things like meat and masculinity, which I guess like speaks a lot to kind of how culturally, important or like how loaded it is.
The other interesting thing about these paid industry talking points, and meat and masculinity is another great example, right? There will be payments to PR firms and influencers and so on to kind of seed these ideas and get them out there. The other interesting thing about this is that they are seeded at as high a level as they can, right? The top influencers, the top news outlets, whatever it may be, and the rest just kind of follow suit. So a lot of people who are parroting these talking points that have been made in some focus group by meat industry interests, they're not even getting paid by the PR firms. They're doing it for free just because the talking points kind of filter down. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about that, right? They're doing this work for free. They should be getting paid. If you're going to lie to the public about, like, the link between red meat and heart disease, for example, come on, at least get paid for it. Don't just do it because your favorite influencer's doing it.
I mean, I think the fossil fuel industry definitely did that as well. Like, they've done so much around kind of saying, you know, if you cut fossil fuels, people will be cold. We won't have energy security. It will risk all those things. I think like those narratives have been picked up and run with by the food industry as well. So there's like so much fear mongering around kind of food security, whether people have enough to meet. Like, you see things when people are lobbying and they're saying, if you introduce this policy, people are going to starve, you know, and it won't be based on science.
Yeah, and the opposite is actually true. As we've seen, we were reading in that AI article the other day, right? A big thing that you can do to actually boost food security is to reduce consumption of animal products, because animal products are amongst the most resource-intensive food products that you can get. And this is why the price of animal products has gone up so much, parallel to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where a lot of the grain is coming from, because a lot of that is animal feed. And so the price of animal products in the UK has gone up as a result of that, because we're very, very reliant on imported animal feed. We have this idea that having more animal farming is somehow going to be a good thing for food security. It's actually the opposite. So much of what we import and are reliant on is animal feed. They were saying in the article the other day, this was a problem for Germany in the war, that they had so much of their food was coming from imports, that was a weakness for them. They were able to be kind of choked out of food imports. This is also why Singapore and Israel are amongst the most advanced countries with respect to alternative proteins. Right, because a lot of their food is imported, and they understand the importance of not being reliant on food imports, and they understand that a lot of food imports is coming from animal feed. So you don't want to populate, from a food security perspective, right? You don't want a population who's heavily reliant on animal products, which are heavily reliant on imported feeds, because that means you're reliant on a lot of imported feed for your food security, right? So the countries with the most concerns for food security and with some of the highest levels of food imports at the moment, being Israel and Singapore, these are the countries which are most advanced with respect to investing in and regulating alternative proteins, because they understand moving away from animal products is going to improve food security. So yeah, it's interesting that is weaponized as a pro-meat talking point when actually it's exactly the opposite. In the UK, the official estimates are, I think, about 85% that we're self-sufficient for pork and poultry, because that's the percentage of pork and poultry which is farmed in the UK. But that doesn't account for imported soy for their feed. So if you account for that, it goes down to, I think, about 57% self-sufficient. So animal feed is a big, big part of food security, and it's something that, we are reliant on a lot of imported animal feed. There's that great graphic in the National Food Strategy which shows the amount of land. Here it is. Yeah, this is the amount of land needed to feed the UK. Oh, I shouldn't have clicked through to that. We could just looked at it on Google Images. Here it is. So yeah, you'll notice that the total amount of land needed to feed the UK is quite a lot larger than the total amount of land in the UK. Because we've got the majority of the UK land taken up by animal farming. Right, here's poultry, pigs, beef, dairy feed, beef feed. And here's all of the land overseas that is required for those products as well. So there's a massive amount of land, more land than we have in the UK, it requires to feed the UK. So how this is anything like food security, or how the animal industries would argue that, I don't know.
Because clearly climate change and biodiversity loss are the biggest threats to food production. But I think you're right in the sense that, like, it's very culturally and emotionally loaded, and it makes that sort of fear-mongering very easy.
Yeah, and I suppose also those messages are easier to communicate. And if you're, an average person who spends most of their days working hard to get enough money just to be able to afford to live and to feed their kids and everything, it means that you don't necessarily have the time, or pardon the pun, the appetite to be spending time reading scientific literature and coming to terms with the nuances of these discussions. And so often what I perceive probably happens is that people find themselves being presented with.
Yeah, true, Po. It's one of those infuriating things that it feels intuitive that it would be bad for food security if we were to reduce our meat production consumption, because that reduced food, right? That feels like it's going to be bad for food security. But actually, the real answer is a little bit more complicated. If you spend like a minute thinking about it, you would realize, actually, we'll obviously be eating something else instead. And pretty much everything is far more land efficient than particularly red meat, right? So it's red meat, I believe, is the least land efficient food that we have. So the more of it that we have, the more land that we need. There was an article, we'll have a look at later, there was an article about the new US food recommendations and how many millions more acres of land that it would need to produce all of the feed needed there, to produce all of the meat recommended in the new guidelines, right? So it's one of these things that feels very intuitive, a bit like with the fossil fuels as well, right? It feels kind of intuitive. Oh, if we had less fossil fuels, then people will be cold. It's like, well, probably we'll have renewable energy instead. And in fact, if we keep on doing fossil fuels and causing climate change, well, we in the UK will be very cold, because we'll have the disrupted whatever it is, the sea flows, right? They say that climate change is going to cause the UK to become much, much colder. It's like there's such a bigger picture that's being missed. Hey, and Def, how you doing? Good to see you. Didn't catch me at the end this time. I got a little ways to go yet.
With sort of simplistic messaging, and everyone can remember things like net zero will bankrupt the country, and plant-based diets will cause mass starvation. These are sort of sensationalist, emotive statements which we can kind of grasp what they mean. But if we then start talking about
the Gulf Stream, yeah, that's it. Thank you, Indef. The Gulf Stream, that's what I'm thinking of.
Net zero more complicated, or transitions to plant-based food systems in ways that is more scientifically sound but is inherently more complicated, it's hard to simplify those messages down, because they're not necessarily simple. And how do we've got to communicate complex ideas and complex policy changes, but in a way that is simple and cuts through all this misinformation and noise. It's really hard.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I feel like that's often one of the biggest problems, is like the misinformation is much easier to understand than the reason why it's wrong.
Yes, exactly. There's that idea that it takes so much.
Yeah, that's so true. And the thing is, there's got to be, and in fact there are, easy to understand things which support the position of reducing animal product consumption. It feels quite intuitive. It's easy for people to understand, hey, less meat is going to be less food security. No, that's not actually how it works. There are simple messages on our side that we can communicate. Honestly, I think factory farming is one of them, right? I've spoken before about how for the average person, a focus on animal cruelty is more compelling than a focus on climate change or health reasons. But a lot of people don't want to go with that. I mean, there's really not much to say when you point to the conditions on factory farms and in slaughterhouses. It's insane how they get away with shit like this. Yeah, it is. I mean, it is. And again, it's evil. Like, who would do this as their profession? Like, what? Imagine going to a cocktail party. What do you do for a living? It's my job to come up with talking points to mislead the public about the need to reduce animal production and consumption so that there are more knives in throats and accelerated climate change. What do you do? You'd be like, can you leave, please? Right? Probably a lot of people lie about their jobs if their jobs are in fact in this area. You'd have to lie, wouldn't you? You'd be embarrassed to say that that's what you did for a living. I come up with talking points and contact journalists to confuse people so that there are more animals killed and climate change accelerates more quickly and more superbugs and more antibiotic resistance. What do you do? Can you leave?
It takes so much more energy to refute, you know, misinformation that it does to create it, which is so true, isn't it? Let's talk a little bit more about misinformation, and something that I've become extremely interested in, sadly so, but extremely interested in, is sort of the rise of populist far-right politics, and in particular to this conversation, how it relates to food and farming narratives and conspiracy theories. And I think what's really scary about the modern times that we live in is that conspiracy theories are not necessarily even that fringe anymore. And I think food and farming is one of those examples where conspiracy theories are quite mainstream. I mean, you spoke earlier about the idea that food has been used as a means to control us. The idea that we'll all be forced to eat bugs, which as a vegan, I still don't think is good. We'll all be forced to eat bugs. And in the UK...
True, that's one area where vegans and anti-vegans can agree. We also will not eat the bugs. That's one thing we can agree on. Indeed,
across the EU and other places, there has been sort of this sort of process where these conspiracy theories are actually becoming intertwined in more mainstream politics. And I think a great example in the UK is Nigel Farage and a campaign group called...
That's so true, InDef. Yeah, they'll rationalise it, right? InDef says in YouTube chat, well, everyone lies at their job. Even kindergarten teachers don't tell kids the truth about Santa. See, we're all the same. That's so true. That's so true. It's definitely going to be a lot of rationalization going on. Now, of course, right, these things are not at all on the same level. In most jobs, there are going to be some things that you can't disclose, like company secrets or whatever else. It's so not the same scale as, like, I run the focus groups to come up with talking groups, to come up with talking points to maintain and expand factory farming. I think you're going to have to lie at the cocktail parties if that's your job, right? They probably also do lie to themselves. Yeah, that's very true.
Called No Farmers, No Food. I'm wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about Nigel, that organization, and maybe more about these conspiracy theories. What are these theories, and what impact do they have?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've also become... totally darkly fascinated by this. Too much time in conspiracy theory.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Nigel Farage, I think probably what you're talking about is we found that in March at a farming protest, Nigel Farage kind of went on stage and said that Labour had, this is his words, a sinister agenda to acquire lots of land because they're planning for another 5 million people to come into the country. And what he was referring to was this conspiracy theory. It's been around in Europe for a while and it seems to be gaining traction in the UK. This theory that kind of plans to change or transition agriculture are to do with the government wanting to do a large-scale land grab so that they can house asylum seekers. So yeah, obviously really scary, in my view, extremely racist stuff. And, you know, it's not just Farage who said this. Last year, Jeremy Clarkson wrote in The Sun that he was again convinced that Labour had a sinister plan to, again, his words, ethnically cleanse the countryside of farmers in order to make room for immigrants and net zero wind farms.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's really scary stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, this particular conspiracy theory is based in, I don't know, have you come across the Great Replacement conspiracy
I have, sadly
theory?
so.
Yes. It has its foundations in kind of very anti-Semitic tropes. But it basically says that elites are trying to replace white people in the West with migrants or asylum seekers.
You do see a lot of this elites terminology amongst a lot of the meatheads. It's the elites that want you to eat the bugs, and it's the elites that want you to eat less meat. Like, it is... I don't know if this was always the case, but it is very much tied into exactly the kind of conspiracy slop that they're talking about here. It appeals to a certain kind of person, right? And we've looked at data before how people who are meat reducers or vegetarians or vegans are more likely to be, politically liberal, are more likely to be well educated and to live in cities. And people who are anti-vegan are likely to be the opposite of all of those things, right? Not politically liberal, not well educated, living into rural states, right? If you're in America, it all correlates quite closely.
There's obviously no evidence supporting this. Civil rights organisations have recognised that it's deeply racist, it's white supremacist, but it has gained quite a lot of traction. And one of the places where it gained traction.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, posted. I wonder why they like or believe in conspiracy theories so much. I think a lot of the appeal of conspiracy theories is this idea that, hey, we're in on the truth that nobody else knows about. And, we're the ones who know what's really going on. And I can see how that appeals to, like, people with lower levels of education, for example, people who feel that they don't have much control over what's going on in the world or in their life. Like, it's very appealing. Even dumb stuff like flat Earth, right? Like, why would you believe in flat Earth? What's the motivation for somebody who gets into that or maintains belief in flat Earth? I think it's this idea that we're the ones who really know, right? We're the kind of special ones who are in on the secret, and everybody else is blind and so on. Like, this is how I feel, by the way, with respect to veganism a lot of the time. There is something in me that says there should be a way of appealing to these kind of conspiracy folks from the vegan perspective. You can talk about how much you would want to be shoulder to shoulder with such people, right, in the movement. But I mean, the kind of stuff that we talk about, like, conspiracy theories are not necessarily false, right? There are real conspiracies. Like, for example, in this case, they're talking about the meat industry have conspired to put out these lies and to promote their industry, right? It's quite a straightforward theory of why this would be the case, and indeed there's evidence that this is the case, right? The Animal Agriculture Alliance having funded the Red Flag PR agency to put out these lies and talking points. There really are conspiracies afoot by evil industries who want certain outcomes. And it's ironic that the people who are being fed those talking points by literally a paid PR agency a lot of times are saying, well, there's a conspiracy on the other side by the elites to make us eat less meat, right? There really has been a conspiracy with respect to what you're eating, but you have been lied to about the benefits of fucking beef tallow, right? And by the way, it's worth pointing out that they are having this conversation, I believe, before Trump 2.0. So all of the if you're thinking that this is in reference to RFK, I think that's right. I think I could be wrong about that. If they're talking, if you're watching this thinking, oh, they're talking about RFK, like this is all predicted rather than observed in the American context at this point. Wish they weren't so far harmful to animals, otherwise they'd be fun to watch. Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, I really, for these people for whom it's important to feel like they're in on the secret, they know the thing that other people won't admit. There should be a way for the animal cause to appeal to these people, because that is the case with a lot of stuff in this world, right? It's just that you have to eat less meat if you want to be a part of that. So it's not as fun. It's a bit more taxing. So just go with the elite stuff instead, huh?
Initially was in the Netherlands, like back in 2019 when they were having big farming protests. That's where the kind of farming version of this seems to have come from. And the government was trying to close down some meat and dairy farms to address pollution problems there. But, the kind of far right populist response to this was to say that it was to house asylum seekers. You talked about impact. Obviously, like, we can't directly say that this is to do with conspiracy theory, but those farmers' protests, which were kind of very charged by things like this conspiracy theory, totally transformed politics in the Netherlands. They ended up with like a pretty populist farming party starting up, which was in the coalition government until very...
Yeah, this was also the dumbest thing. The Netherlands thing, there was a proposed buyout of livestock farms by the government to address largely nitrogen pollution. And they were offered very good deals, right? More than the land was actually worth. The government said, we're going to pay it. We're offered to pay you, right, more than your land's actually worth in order to stop doing the harmful farming and reduce the nitrogen pollution. And somehow this was twisted into like forced buyouts, and we're being told that we have to leave our land. This was never the case. It was always an optional deal and a bloody good deal. But it was made into this narrative like the government's coming to seize your land. Like that was never the case. There was never anyone who was forced to sell their farm.
Very recently, the next elections saw big wins for the far right. So yeah, I mean, again, you can't say that it was down to this conspiracy theory, but it definitely kind of charged that landscape.
Absolutely. I think the thing about these theories is they're sort of broader than just the individual theory. What we were speaking about with the sort of food and farming conspiracy theories relates to, xenophobia. It relates to sort of conspiracy theories around, you see Great Replacement, the Great Reset, asylum seekers. And so these kind of theories, they sort of feed off one another. And the Netherlands thing is so interesting, as you say, because of there's this clear problem, a nitrogen crisis in the Netherlands, which has been known about for decades, has continued to get increasingly worse as the years have gone by, and reached the point where I think the Netherlands had broken EU law, was it related to it? So there is no dispute that there's a nitrogen crisis, and the number one driver of that, cattle farming for meat and dairy, and something needed to be done about it. And the way I suppose the narrative was weaponized, as you say, was to say, look, the government's going to come in. This is authoritarianism. This is tyranny. They're going to remove hardworking farmers from their land and then take this land and, give it over for asylum seekers. And it's just, there's this detachment from reality that...
I have to say, I didn't know the asylum seekers part of that narrative. Again, it was optional buyouts, right? Nobody was having their land seized. They were offered very good deals, many of which chose to decline those deals and just carried on, and that was allowed to happen. But yeah, I didn't know that it was tied into... But it makes sense, right? Like, why not also tie it into a bit of xenophobia?
That occurs. But what I think... the way they legitimize these ideas is by taking kernels of truth, which is there is a problem. The farmers were being offered buyout schemes that would mean that the state would buy out the land. And then they take those things and they just ramp them up to 11, distort the truth, and then use them and apply them to different conspiracy theories to feed into that political base that they're appealing to. And you just go, this is so rampant. It's like a wildfire that you can't get any control over. And it's really frightening. And I think in the UK, we like to falsely perceive ourselves as being somewhat immune from some of this. But actually, that's not really the case. You're talking about Nigel Farage, saying Jeremy Clarkson, these are not fringe figures.
No.
These are very mainstream figures. I mean, especially Nigel Farage at the moment. And it makes you scared what will happen in 4 years' time, let's say, if current polling continues the way that it is and nothing really changes. We might have a similar situation here where this person who is deeply racist, who makes terrible claims and is obviously anti-climate science in all the ways that climate science exists, might be the one coming up with policies to determine what happens in this country. And that's frightening. So there is that conspiracy theory, but what about the idea of sort of eating bugs? That's another one that kind of comes into it as well.
Oh yeah, people love that one.
Yes.
Yeah, so that one, again, which has spread really rapidly, I think.
Let me be the first to say, I will not eat the bugs.
It actually came from a joke meme and then has been turned into a conspiracy theory that people really buy. But essentially, it's the idea that the World Economic Forum and the UN and Bill Gates and other kind of powerful figures,
True, Poe,
are using climate policies in order to control the food system and force everyone to eat bugs.
Right.
And meat will only be available to the rich. But yeah, it's kind of wild. Like, it really has taken hold in some places. We did an investigation last year with...
Hey, actually, there is insect lobby, public procurement. Have a look at this. This is actually wild. Here's this article on Euractiv. There is a lobby for... This is real, okay? This is a real-life Eat the Bugs conspiracy. Again, not all conspiracies are lies, right? In this case, the International Platform of Insects for Food and Feed is eyeing the review of EU public procurement rules as a last-ditch effort to support the struggling sector. In a response to the European consultation on the new rules, IPIF argued that mandating minimum purchases of innovative circular bio-based products could help safeguard the industry. Under such a scheme, the EU would allow public buyers to prioritise products on sustainability grounds, meaning Brussels could, in theory, mandate the purchase of insect-based protein for public institutions, including canteens or school cafeterias. So there actually is now the insect lobby asking for mandatory purchasing of insects as food for public institutions, including schools, hospitals, and so on. So there you go. They're talking before this came out, but this is a submission from actually an industry protein lobby talking about mandatory purchasing of insects for schools. Kind of wild. Life imitating art, I suppose. This has got to be a good bit of bait for the right-wing conspiracy people. Let them have at it, right? I will not eat the bugs. I don't think that's a good thing. And so it would be shocking if that was allowed to happen. There's a lot of reasons that we shouldn't be going after insect farming as a solution to the climate crisis, by the way. Many of the environmental impacts, many of the environmental benefits which people expected from insect farming are going to be nowhere near the scale originally anticipated. They're basically on par with a lot of other animal products because you have to have the insect farms at a particular temperature, which is very difficult to achieve, so it takes a lot of energy. Then getting it into formats which anyone is vaguely willing to eat, like cricket flour rather than just whole bugs, is again very energy intensive. So any of the climate gains which you make compared to farming larger animals, you basically lose in the heating and then processing stages. And there are public health risks, right? There are diseases which can spread in these insect colonies. There are also mostly invasive insect species being farmed in areas where they're not native. So this is one thing where, again, we're going to be we're going to be lockstep with some of the right wingers on this. I will not eat the bugs. This is definitely something which we shouldn't be going after. And so, you know, for all of the people who are terribly worried about Eat Lancet and so on, this would actually be a good thing to direct them towards, right? We will not eat the bugs. There is the insect industry lobby in Europe trying to get this to be mandatory purchases for European institutions. Like, this is actually pretty shocking. I'm going to put the link to this in chat so that people can have a look. But yeah, that's not the direction we want to be going in. And of course, from an animal suffering perspective, right? This small body problem. Let's have a little look at Brown Research small body problem. Here's the number of animals required for a ton of each of these kind of products. For a ton of beef, we're looking at 3 cows, or almost 600 chickens, or about 5 million crickets. Right, it's going to be a little bit similar to the shrimp conversation which we were having the other day. There's a likelihood that, you know, there's a lower likelihood of consciousness, or rather, perhaps a more basic form of consciousness. But that is not offset by the vastly higher numbers of animals included. So, yeah, I will not eat the bugs. Televir says, would you include donating to farm animal sanctuaries in the Vegan 2.0 concept? I would not. I would not, because I'll tell you why. It's a very inefficient use of money to help animals. It's lovely for animals who get to live on sanctuaries, and they need, you know, food, medicine, and everything else. But that's very, very expensive. It's very expensive to feed animals. Most of the costs of animal farming are in animal feed. So it's very expensive to feed animals, and the more of them that the animal movement has and is responsible for feeding is basically soaking up resources which could be going towards actually shutting down factory farms, getting animals out of factory farming situations, right? You know, what they say, like a white elephant, right, is a metaphor for a gift that somebody gives you that ends up being a massive liability. Because the idea is that a white elephant, just like cows and pigs and whatever other animals on sanctuaries, it feels like a nice thing, but it's actually a massive ongoing cost. So yeah, I don't include sanctuaries in the Vegan 2.0 concept, but the effective giving is a big part of the giving in Vegan 2.0. We're only really interested in the opportunities that can help as many animals as possible for a given amount of money. And sanctuaries are going to be, honestly, kind of the opposite of that. It's going to be quite expensive to run and help like a few dozen animals. And for that same amount of money, you could be helping thousands and thousands of animals. So I don't include sanctuaries in the Vegan 2.0 concept. Good question, though. I appreciate it.
Yeah, lots of brilliant reporters across Europe, and in Italy found, you know, that one of the far right parties for the election was putting out billboards that use this conspiracy theories with massive pictures of the bugs saying that the EU was going to force you to eat bugs and things like this. So yeah.
Oh, great. The right wing's already on it. Good. We don't need to worry too much about fighting the bugs, or at least, you know, that's something that we should, we can stoke opposition to that in other quarters. We are opposed to the bugs, but there's enough other opposition to it that perhaps it's not something that the animal movement needs to spend its resources prioritizing. I'm sure that it ought to some extent, and there is, you know, it seems to be worth having some amount of resources to combat this, but there's another big constituent that will be opposed to eating the bugs. So that's strategically something that we should look to activate.
I mean, it seems like totally bonkers, but it is being weaponized politically for sure.
The bugs thing I find really fascinating. Again, I think there's a lot of xenophobia in there because bugs have been eaten around the world for centuries, and for, many people eating bugs is completely normal. And for me as an ethical vegan, I think there's a huge level of cognitive dissonance and hypocrisy when it comes to saying, oh, we want to eat these animals, not those animals. And, we're scared of eating these animals. I mean, it seems kind of funny to me to kind of view it through that lens. But I suppose it's all about control, isn't it? And I think that's what the conspiracy theorist fears the most. It's the idea of having their autonomy denied to them, sort of control taken away, their ability to do what they choose, and we're all going to be in 15-minute cities with Bill Gates microchips eating bugs every day, and but these fears really do influence people, and I suppose when we think about elections, even outside of conspiracy theories, elections play out through fear-mongering, whether it's about the economy, whether it's about migration, whatever it might be. It's sort of the fear narratives that often cut through. How do we sort of get through that then? How do we breach this sort of fear narrative and compel people to not be sort of swayed by that?
I think in my view, like part of it is showing that there's kind of opportunities in transition. Like, I guess like the classic example would be like actually retrofitting homes, putting insulation in, stuff like that is really good for people and could really benefit people's quality of life. And same, meat and dairy reduction, the level of meat that we eat at the moment has such a high correlation with non-communicable diseases that it actually, it has a lot of personal benefits as well. So I think part of it's highlighting that. But I also think like with the fear narrative, alongside the fear narrative, a lot of what conspiracy theories are trying to do is create the like us versus them, elites versus normal people, everything's topped, like it's all about that kind of like sense of division. And I think that part of the reason or part of the risk with climate transition is that if you don't do it right and you don't do a just transition, like the costs can be borne by normal people. They could potentially be borne by people like farmers. And I do think, if you look at the kind of level of chaos and uncertainty Labour seems to have brought around farming since it came in, like you can see that farmers are becoming more and more resentful. And that is a breeding ground for conspiracy theories. Like, I think we need to be really careful how we do transition, as well as making it seem like a positive thing, so we don't lay the...
I really do think there's a lot that, again, this is a little bit counterintuitive, but there is a lot that vegans and animal advocates should agree with farmers on in terms of the current political changes that are going on. For one great example is the reduction of exemptions for inheritance tax. Farms will now have to pay more inheritance tax. This is something that a lot of pro-animal people will kind of instinctively support and think, that's something that we should celebrate, right? More tax on farms, great. Sort of counterintuitively, right, that's only a tax that's going to apply, or an exemption that would have applied right now, a tax which will apply if the farm is also your home. So it is something that was an advantage for small-scale farmers over factory farms, and has now been exempted, right? So that is actually going to be something that the factory farms will have been celebrating. Right, it's going to be more tax on our competition in the form of small farms. So I don't think that that's necessarily going to be a good thing for animals. The other thing about low welfare imports, I think that's a big area of agreement between animal advocates and farmers, again, except for big factory farming companies, right, who are, again, they're celebrating if they're allowed to just freely trade the lowest welfare stuff across any borders they want to. But in terms of the experience of the animal, and in terms of the experience of small farmers in the UK or elsewhere where these policies are being debated, there's agreement amongst animal advocates and animal farmers that we should not allow low welfare imports. So there are some areas where animal advocates and animal farmers are going to agree, particularly in the current parliament in the UK.
The groundwork for populist and far right characters to just swoop in and make the most of it.
That's right. I mean, they're opportunistic vultures. You've got to try and sort of keep them at bay, I think. And you touched on a really great point, which was how do we sort of spread the costs out so that it's not impacting consumers? And I think the idea of like a meat tax has always kind of made me feel a little uncomfortable, because it's essentially making the consumer pay for something. And I think what is a strong message to communicate is, in the UK at least, the NHS we know is struggling, perpetually underfunded, and yet we are squandering millions and millions of pounds, billions of pounds indeed, on preventable diseases, and a lot of those preventable diseases are linked to diet and lifestyle. And if we were to sort of champion more plant-forward diets, and we were to sort of inspire people to eat more healthy plants, and we were to give them more access to be able to do so, we could actually have a positive impact on the economy. And I think that sometimes these narratives are lost because maybe they're just viewed as too politically toxic. Is there an argument that I mean, Labour, it feels so weak and so...
Here's a good bit of work that we did for the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation. Again, they're talking about opportunities for Labour, and also like how can what are things that might appeal to more right of centre people politically. We work with the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation, are very good at have a sense for this. They're run by people who are conservative and are also animal advocates. We calculated that the diseases associated with overconsumption of animal products, the increased risk of heart disease and cancer and diabetes and obesity entailed by overconsumption of animal products, is adding about £2 billion a year in terms of costs that the NHS has to bear and that the taxpayer has to bear to deal with these health problems resulting from an overconsumption of animal products. So it is something, again, where the cost is being put onto society. People are having much higher rates of cancer and heart disease than they would if we would reduce meat consumption. And I think this is the amount associated with quite a modest reduction in meat consumption. If the British population ate meat-free lunches on weekdays, improved health could save the NHS as much as $2.2 billion annually. There was a similar analysis by the Vegan Society and the Office of Health Economics around the same time, which came up with very similar figures. I think they expressed it in terms of if we were to, if the country was to go vegan, right? If the reduction in animal products was 100%. And I think they had a figure closer to 10 billion. But we were talking in terms of a much more modest amount of meat reduction, and still we're coming up with a similar scale of impacts. £2 billion that is spent on the healthcare system explicitly for problems associated with overconsumption of meat and animal products. So, yeah, that's something that people right of centre might like to think about.
So, it's just lacking any grit and anything substantial, and they're putting themselves in this situation where they're alienating everyone across the political spectrum. They're appealing to people on the right who will never vote for them, and in doing so, alienating the people on the left who actually won them the election, driving them away to the Greens or whoever it may be. And you're just thinking, why can't we just get some cohesive, strong narratives that are properly communicated to the public and actually address the needs of the public meaningfully? But do you think that these issues, are they too politically contentious? Is talking about diet and plant-forward thinking and veganism even, let's say, are these things just too politically toxic for people like Keir Starmer or whoever it is to actually meaningfully want to address?
My buddy told me yesterday, Keir Starmer's a pescatarian. Who knew that? I didn't know that. That's pretty cool. I've seen him talking about the vegan burgers at McDonald's before, very based. One of my favourite things, as you know. Had 3 of them yesterday. That's real, by the way. That's real. I did. I had 3 of them in one sitting. But yeah, apparently Keir Starmer's a pescatarian. That's interesting, though, because in a sense, that's not politically correct in a weird way, right? If politically correct means the correct thing for a politician to say to appeal to the masses, then being pescatarian is probably not politically correct in a weird way. So I guess there's a reason that I didn't know that. He doesn't make a thing of it because it is going to be culture wars and everything else, right? But yeah, let's see what she says. Is it too toxic to talk about politically? Hopefully not. I mean, well, we'll see.
The answer is probably like yes at the moment. They are really contentious. They've been made really contentious. So I think like going head first into strong things around, like, for example, a meat tax could be really politically difficult. But equally, like, I think there's so much that we can do in terms of, for example, some of it I think is just about rebalancing the power. Like at the moment, McDonald's is, I think, the biggest advertiser in the UK. So, if you had like more things in place around advertising for meat and dairy, which reflect...
They got me. You're even getting plugged McDonald's on the vegan streams now.
The climate science, which reflected, the move towards banning greenwashing, for example, that could have a really big impact. So I don't know. I think there's plenty that can be done, even if the headlong stuff around dietary change would be quite complicated with this landscape.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's not just the political arena that needs to change. It's also sort of other aspects. And yeah, the Advertising Standards Agency in the UK needs to become stronger. It needs to have more strict guidelines, strict policies around the claims that are made, how they're substantiated. There's the kind of like these phrases that are inherently meaningless, but are employed by companies focused towards sustainable production or moving in a sustainable direction or championing a sustainable world. These kind of empty, meaningless greenwashing phrases, which I suppose sort of devalue sort of the environmental message by just making it nothing, right? Making it just so airy and like lacking substance. But as well as doing that, they're sort of driving the idea that these foods are part of a sustainable world, or these companies, more importantly, are working towards sustainable objectives, even though they're actually not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this was actually some really interesting research done by the campaign organisation Changing Markets Foundation, which we covered. But essentially, they looked at kind of how much the world's biggest meat and dairy companies were spending on advertising and how much they were spending on sustainability. And they're spending a lot more on advertising. So, for example, the Brazilian meat giant JBS, the world's biggest meat company, they invested just like 0.03% of their revenues into climate measures in 2022. And that was kind of a fraction of what they were spending on advertising. So yeah, totally. These companies are definitely putting more effort into propping up their image. And I think part of that is certainly propping up a kind of green image. I mean, we were talking before about this, weren't we? That I think like it's very easy for companies. Farming so often is associated with that kind of like bucolic fields and lambs prancing along. And it's very easy for meat and dairy companies to make the most of that preconception in their advertising when maybe like a fraction of their products are produced in that way or none of their products are produced in that way. But it's very hard to regulate because, there is some truth in the fact that some of the UK has prancing lambs in green fields.
Yeah, the way that they...
Bucolic is one of those words that I've only ever heard in that context. What does it actually mean? Relating to pleasant aspects of the countryside and countryside life. Okay, fair enough. Well, there you go.
Present their industry is always, look, these fields and there's these animals grazing. And I think even within that, like when you look at the climate science, we know that these outdoor grazing areas are among the least sustainable forms of food production because of the land that's used, because of the methane being produced by these grazing animals. But that's, again, those are kind of more complex scientific ideas, whereas for most people, we are used to having a romanticized version of farming that we view as being sort of holistic and sustainable because it's animals outside on grass and that's where they belong and they're happy on grass and this is part of the natural world.
Earthling is so smart, by the way. Obviously, he's written books on this and knows the stuff very well. When I did his show, I kind of had a little bit of an attitude of like, well, I'm the researcher going to do this show, and this guy's primarily a YouTuber, and I'm going to be able to tell him about the science and so on. And there's so many moments in there where I was like, damn, yeah, actually, okay, this guy knows more about this than I did. Like, he is very, very well informed. Don't let it fool you that he's primarily an influencer or a YouTuber or whatever. Like, this guy is very, very smart. He knows his stuff.
Well, again, there are these very simplistic narratives, but they really work because they just sink into people's minds and they really shape their perception of them. And so now, yeah, it's hardly surprising that this is the advertising that's thrust upon us, even though it isn't sustainable and I would say ethical, but it also doesn't represent the vast majority of the industry anyway. So that it's just complete false advertising in that sense.
And I think also like part of the issue in my view is that we see farming and livestock farming as kind of one whole sector, whereas actually there's like lots of variation within it. And I think, obviously there are kind of small scale farmers, there are farmers who are using livestock alongside food crops in a way that potentially is more sustainable, but they're a very, very small fraction. And there's the big kind of JBSs of the world who are massive polluters, and they're all clubbed together and seen as one. I feel like in quite a lot of the lobbying, lobby groups for those kind of huge producers can use that fact that everyone sees farming as this kind of single sector, and make the most of the fact that they're representing the farmers, whereas actually they can be representing multi-million-pound multinationals,
I think what's interesting is there are discrepancies within animal farming. I mean, my position is always, there might be more sustainable ways of doing it or more ethical ways of doing it, but that doesn't mean that they are the most sustainable or ethical ways of producing food when we don't have to use animals. But I also think there is a really interesting component to that, which is how these big lobby groups, PR firms, they sort of appropriate the language used by other types of farming, sustainable, but more recently sort of regenerative. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden you hear JBS saying, we're pushing on with regenerative measures, and Burger King source this from there, and you go, this is completely meaningless. But again, these words do carry power, but these terms are just...
Yeah, there's a good point in here that the lobbyists, like where the money is to pay the lobbyists and the PR firms, is in the factory farming companies, right? In the JBSs and the Tysons and the what's the European chicken one I'm thinking of? I want to say PWC, but it's not PHC or something like that. Someone will tell me in chat. That's where the money is. That's that's on whose behalf the lobbying is being done. But they are appropriating the imagery and the kind of mask of the small bucolic farms, and those are the very people that they're undermining. It's got to be infuriating if you are one of those small farms, and I suppose that's why you have to be distracted so much by all the nonsense about alternative proteins and the vegans are the enemy and everything else. Right, it is being done by these few large factory farming corporations who are concentrating the power then. Again, going to be great debate for the conspiracy theorists if they could ever see the fact of the matter. Right, these few mega farming companies who now own a substantial amount of the UK farms, right, often American companies, and they are undermining precisely the people that they're claiming to represent in terms of the small farms throughout the country. Ed's very, very good at steering the conversation where it needs to go in a friendly way, and he will make points and correct points, but won't let you feel that you've gone astray. He's a very talented interviewer.
Just their labels assigned to create an impression of something that isn't actually there, and regenerative is just another buzzword like grass-fed or organic or pasture-based or whatever the phrasing may be. It's just become another symbol of what I believe is just another form of greenwashing, really. It's just...
Yeah, that's a good point as well, right? There's not... these terms are not regulated. There's nothing that... There's no list of things to be signed off to be able to call your stuff regenerative or sustainable or whatever else. It's just a meaningless thing that you can slap on there without actually having to meet any particular criteria. It is just a marketing term. It is. And interestingly, they will resist the attempts to say, okay, well, look, there could be some farming systems which are, let's say, better. Well, let's say better for the climate than some others. In the extreme case, they claim that there are some farming systems that will sequester carbon. When I looked into that a bit, that appears to be bollocks. They're mainly talking about basically lower impact systems combined with different forms of offsetting. So they're like, we have cows that produce less methane and we also plant trees. It's like, okay, the implication was that the cows are removing carbon from the atmosphere through the soil health and everything else, right? Isn't that what this was meant to be about? No, not quite. There's actually no such thing as carbon negative beef. But, if it can be done in such a way where if you plant a load of trees as well, then you can get there. It's like, well, couldn't you just plant the trees and not do the beef? So, yeah, there's no regulation of these things, and they will resist attempts to introduce regulation of them because they want to keep it as vague as possible, right? They want to have the benefits of being able to claim these things and none of the obligations of actually having to implement anything that might be costly to do that would actually be beneficial to the environment, right? So yeah, these things are poorly defined, and that's kind of on purpose so that they can be kept vague and applied widely without any proper scrutiny or oversight.
A nicer way of saying the same thing, which isn't true.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm fascinated by Eat Balanced because it has, I sadly believe, had a strong impact in the UK. And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about the Eat Balanced campaign and also talk about sort of the relationship between Eat Balanced, those behind it, and sort of more mainstream government backing of those things. Not necessarily.
Hey, Eat Balanced, that was the AHDB campaign that we got a correction on their misleading report about red meat, which incorrectly claimed that there's no convincing evidence for a link between red meat and heart disease. And I pointed out this was incorrect. We looked into it a little bit. Some people in the Discord were helping me to look into particular claims here. And we found that it was referencing this umbrella review, which had clear errors in a particular table that they had included in the original report. I have a video about this on the channel called how the meat industry distorts the science on heart health or something like that. And they did in the end change that report. They corrected it. They had to issue a correction. There actually, in fact, is convincing evidence of a link between red meat and heart disease, right? We're sorry, we lied and said that there wasn't. By the way, they've just come out with a new report about dairy with similar themes. I haven't looked into it yet, but I commented on it on LinkedIn. I wonder if I were to look into this, whether I would discover some false claims that you'll have to correct, like you did in your red meat report. No response from anyone at AHDB. And there, I think lead scientist, a guy called Matthew Elms, has been debating me as well. So yeah, I mean, again, they're paid to promote red meat and dairy, so what do you expect?
Necessarily a backing of meat and dairy diets overtly, but just sort of a funding element that's been involved between governments and this campaign in the UK.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I imagine a lot of people have seen Let's Eat Balanced. But basically every January, an organisation called the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, or AHDB, which is easier to say.
Yes.
So the AHDB puts out this advertising campaign. It's specifically timed to coincide with Veganuary, and it's specifically aimed at maintaining meat and dairy levels in the UK, which obviously, flies in the face of climate science. But they put out this advertising campaign which is usually around the kind of nutritional benefits of meat and dairy. And when we looked at it, which was last January. They were very heavily targeting Gen Z. So they were working with influencers. All their videos were young people making smoothies, things like this. And yeah, promoting kind of...
If you want to know some of the motivation for this, by the way, here's another excellent Bryant research piece, the UK protein transition in 4 graphs. I'll put the link to this in the chat as well. This is a few years old, but here we can see some telling trends as to why you might want to have an organisation like the AHDB putting out misinformation in order to maintain red meat and dairy consumption. There's actually been a pretty steady decline in per capita meat consumption in the UK over the 10-year period from 2009 to 2019. 17% reduction in per capita meat consumption. That is not nothing. That is quite a substantial reduction in a 10-year period to 2019. Annoyingly, I believe that there has been a change in the way that this is measured. So this is from a paper in 2021, and I looked into this a little bit to see if there was any way of getting the data to continue on this trend to more recent years. And I believe there's been a change in the way that this is measured, so it's not quite straightforward to do that. But look, within this, so 17% reduction in per capita meat consumption in the UK, and that is especially the case for red meat consumption, 37% down between 2008 and 2019. 37% in 10, 11 years. Yeah, I'd be putting a few quid into misinformation campaigns to try and bolster that if that was my industry, right? That sucks. If you're the red meat industry, you're gonna want to do something about that. Ducking is non-vegan language. True, race lever based. Good to see you. I've been cancelled.
It's great for this nutrient. It's great for this mineral. And obviously, when you talk to nutritionists, they say this is misleading because the amount of meat and dairy that we're eating in the UK is above dietary recommendations. And it's actually potentially quite far above what's healthy, given the links to non-communicable disease.
Yeah, absolutely. IHDB likes to talk about, we recommend consumption in line with the Eat Well guide. That's no more than 70 grams per day of red and processed meat. So if you're having one beef quarter pounder, you are going well over the recommendations in the Eat Well guide. Like 1 quarter pounder, that's too much red meat. So they like to talk about, well, we're recommending in line with the Eat Well guide. No, they're not. They're absolutely advocating for as much meat consumption as possible. Again, that's what they get paid to do. So, what do you expect?
But this campaign, I mean, it's really interesting, partly because of the impact.
The animal is named after the verb. Is that true? Ducks duck below the water, don't they? Is that real? I've never heard of that before. That's cool if so.
It's had. So when it came out last year in 2024, they were expecting it to reach 9 out of 10 adults in the UK.
Really?
And we got, through doing some kind of freedom of information requests, we got hold of some of their kind of internal marketing stuff, which showed that people in previous years who'd been exposed to the campaign were something like 11% more likely to buy meat in their next shop.
Really?
So we know that it's having a real impact. But the other element that's really interesting, as you mentioned, is that the AHDB is actually overseen or in some ways part of DEFRA. The UK government's farming department, essentially.
Yeah, right.
And the way that it works is an arm's length department. So it is governed independently, but DEFRA has oversight. It's funded through kind of mandatory taxes on farmers. So farmers don't really have a choice whether they pay into it or not. And about 10% of that money is used every year on this advertising campaign. And the AHDB also gets government funding as well.
Right.
How mad are you if you're a red meat producer and you have a mandatory tax applied and a chunk of that is going towards pro-meat propaganda that then gets completely debunked and destroyed. Where did that tax go? That was so pointless.
And yeah, when we asked the government about this, they said that they kind of couldn't comment on the AHDB's activities.
It's quite interesting that that's the situation, because even though the government has a relationship with the AHDB are the ones behind this eBounds campaign, the UK government also has a food strategy review that they've published, which shows that we need to reduce the amount of animal products that we're consuming to meet UK climate targets. So there's this sort of this strange discrepancy between what the UK government's own food strategy review is saying and then what these organisations that DEFRA is linked with, tied to in some ways, what they're promoting. Surely the government should be sort of advocating for us to be consuming fewer products, not necessarily providing funding to organisations that are telling us to, well, maybe increase the amount that we're consuming.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's fascinating. I think like the AHDB would say that it represents farmers and is steered by farmers. Again, it's adverts. You know, I was speaking to experts who were saying this flies in the face of science. So arguably, you know, they should be acting in a way that is in line with the science and therefore in line, you know, they could be supporting them to transition.
That's the thing that really frustrates me. Again, it's a little bit like what I was saying earlier. It frustrates me because I feel like farmers are being let down by the people who represent them, because we can't continue like this. And, you know, the continuing as we are is of no benefit to farmers in the long run, especially the next generation. So the people who are farming now, their children and their children's children, these are the people who are living off the land currently, but who will be able to do so less because of the impacts of climate change. And I find it so frustrating that it is these organisations that should actually be the voice of farmers and should be helping them are the ones that are continuing them on this road, which is not even to their benefit necessarily. I feel like there's a lack of responsibility and accountability being held on the heads of these organisations, and maybe the scientific literature and even maybe the vegan conversation about animal rights can sometimes focus on farmers, but I also think there's the argument that it is these huge bodies, these organisations that are funded by farmers and indeed receive funding from the government, who are at most to blame for the continuation of these harmful industries. What can we do about that? I mean, that's a bit of a mad question, I suppose, to ask you, because it's not as easy as that. But should there be more accountability held on these organisations, and should the government be holding them to account for not following the scientific literature?
In my view, yes, you should be held to account for not following science. I mean,
when you deny reality like this and say, well, we don't really like the stuff about methane causing climate change, so we're just going to completely ignore that and talk about regenerative farming instead. Or when you say, we don't really like the stuff about the link between red meat and heart disease, so we're just going to say that there's no convincing evidence for that and say that red meat's actually really healthy for you. There's not a sustainable strategy, is it? When you deny reality like this, it's not going to be a sustainable strategy. It's not going to be good for you in the long term. It's very short-sighted. Like, it's going to, you know, boost meat sales by 11% or whatever, but it's not going to ensure a good future for your children or ensure that, reduction in disease burden caused by animal products. It's not a good thing that one arm of the government is saying, or, you know, several arms of the government are saying from a health perspective, right, the overconsumption of animal products putting all these burdens on the healthcare system, and from an environmental perspective, we need to cut meat consumption by 30% in order to meet the UK's climate change targets. And then other arms of the same government are saying, well, we're actually going to fund these misinformation campaigns promoting more consumption of meat and dairy. Like, it's so disconnected. There needs to be a coherent strategy. We need to reduce meat production and consumption. Okay, that is the long-term reality. There are some actors for whom that's going to suck in the short term, but those actors cannot be prioritized over everybody else, right? We can't sleepwalk our way into climate change and an ever-increasing public health emergency by just for the purpose of like short-term economic benefits for the animal agriculture industries is not a smart thing to be doing, right? We could boost revenue for tobacco companies if we just deny the science about smoking causing lung cancer. But that's probably not a good idea to be doing that.
I think it's incredibly complicated because I think a lot of these organizations essentially have a conflict of interest at their heart.
Right.
Like, it's more obvious. So a lot of my work has focused on the EU. And if you look at the main kind of farming lobby group in the EU, is called Copa-Cogeca. And it essentially represents farmers, but it also represents agri-cooperatives. And those are like some of the biggest multinational food companies in Europe. So it's people like, you know, Danish Crown, that's one of the biggest pork producers. And there is a tension. Like, ultimately, companies are making a lot of profit from very large-scale monoculture, intensive, polluting forms of agriculture, and want that to continue, even, if farmers want to transition. So I think government should be holding these groups to account, but I think there's also a bigger problem in terms of how farming unions are structured and things like this, that there isn't enough power in kind of small scale farmers. And the loudest and wealthiest voices are usually the ones that are making the most profit from polluting systems.
And I suppose they're the ones in the EU, they're the ones who are reaping the most from subsidy policies there as well. Because the subsidy system in the EU is set up to benefit those who own the most amount of land, right? So it's naturally leads to taxpayers' money being funneled through to people who are already wealthy and are among the wealthiest people.
Yeah, that's mental, by the way. A lot of this ultimately comes down to land ownership. Like, it's madness that the biggest expenditure in the EU, by the way, which is Common Agriculture Policy, makes up about 40% of the EU's budget, primarily goes to benefit people who own the most land. That's not how it should work, is it? Like, literally the wealthiest landowners are the largest beneficiaries of taxes and government expenditure. Like, that's not what we would hope is happening here. I need to look into that further because that makes a lot of sense. It's a problem that animal agriculture is a very good way to create demand for land, and that the powerful landowners, therefore, is in their interests to not have any messaging about meat reduction out there, to have, you know, as much competition for that land as possible, therefore make their land as valuable as possible. So the wealthiest landowners do not want a reduction in consumption of animal products. That's a big problem. I'm not quite sure what can be done about that. We'll look into that more, and we'll have a think about that in a future stream, I think.
Within the community, because they have the most amount of land and also receiving the highest amount of subsidies. The whole system seems broken.
Totally, yeah. There has been some shift to integrate some nature-based stuff in it, but yeah, like you said, it's mostly still based on the amount of land people have, and that does mean small-scale farmers get very little. But it's really hard to make these things change. I mean, you asked before about kind of connections between the government and organisations, and Copa-Cogeca has, I mean, it has unreal access to politics, like so much more than any other lobby group I've ever seen.
Really?
They have unparalleled access in terms of briefing ministers. They've openly admitted they have this kind of huge number of meetings. They've openly admitted to drafting amendments that MEPs then put to the European Parliament. You know, they have an unbelievable amount of power, you know, even to the extent that, like, so this union, Copa-Cogeca, has members in all the different EU states, and lots of MEPs within countries have formal or informal links to these unions. So, for example, one of them has their office space paid for by one of these unions. One of these unions is partly led by the brother of an MEP. You know, there's all these kind of, these really deep political ties that, mean that it is so hard to shift things like the cap subsidy system that you were talking about.
It's crazy. And there's also, I suppose, like a revolving door between politics and the private sector, and that also relates to the agricultural private sector. And obviously, we'll talk a bit more about the EU in just a moment, but in the US, under Biden was that I think it was the Secretary of Agriculture was someone called Tom Vilsack, who was part of the dairy industry before then. So it's just this revolving door. And how can we expect the person in charge of agriculture in the US to be followed by the scientific literature and by what's reasonable and necessary if they have ties to one of the industries that needs changing and needs to be, updated? It's kind of almost, it's just so, it feels so heavy sometimes to be like, wow, this is this huge behemoth that's in front of us, and there's no accountability because everyone's involved with one another in different ways and has relations either literally through bloodlines or just through ideologies and previous career paths.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Vilsack example is amazing because he was also in government under Obama, and then he left government under Obama, went to a dairy lobby group, and then came back to government under Biden. So he did a double revolving door.
Wow. Okay, wow. He's getting whiplash.
Yeah.
But then that also just shows, like, we speak about right-wing and populist right-wing politics, but there's been, it seems like a failure from the left, from left-wing politicians at least. Maybe calling Biden a left-wing politician is somewhat up for debate, but from centrist politicians and left-wing politicians to also meaningfully engage with this. We expect it from Farage, we expect it from Trump, we expect it from right-wing populists.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree. I think, Labour clearly is not doing enough on a lot of these topics. I think, honestly, like, in my view, one of Labour's biggest failings has just been having this absolute kind of crazy ride for farmers that has just lost their support. I think when I've interviewed farmers, like, the level of anger and disappointment is kind of unreal. I think, whatever you think of things like the inheritance tax laws, they were politically incredibly unhelpful. And it means that on things like climate and the environment, they've lost support of people that they need the backing of.
Feels like they've made just a number of terrible decisions and overlooked sort of the big picture change that's needed. And, whether it's the winter fuel allowance, is like these things that are not shifting the dial enough to be a part of the conversation meaningfully, and yet they become these huge dominant narratives that dictate the media landscape, dictate the conversation, and ultimately will shape people's perceptions of the government. And it's just like, why this? Why? Surely you've got strategists who could see this coming. We all could see it coming. How could you not, But if we talk about the EU, obviously the EU has been notable in the past sort of half decade or so for the farming protests that have taken place there. And I think you're quite right to sort of analyse that relationship between EU members and that sort of private sector in the lobbying world. But there's also sort of the mobilisation of farmers that's occurred in the EU. What strikes me as interesting about farming is the ability to mobilise. You think about maybe fossil fuels, you don't really think about sort of mobilisation of oil rig workers, sort of taken to the streets. And the tobacco industry, it doesn't happen. But with farming, they've kind of got tractors and they can occupy roads and they can spray slurry, and they can do things that are quite visual. They can take up space. There's lots of them, and there's lots of people who are sympathetic.
Yeah, the slurry thing is mental, by the way. Like, how definitely illegal is that? I can get fined if I don't pick up my dog's poo, and you've got farmers spraying cow shit all over the gaff. Like, that's mad. That's a madness. Like, that's so, you can't do that, mate. That's not a peaceful protest.
Pathetic to them, it seems. Do you think that kind of ability to mobilise has played a part in sort of the watering down of regulations within the EU's proposals?
I think probably to a certain extent, yes. Like, the farming protests obviously were timed before the election, and politicians are absolutely scrambling to show that they have that vote. So I think that they responded to those protests in a way that they wouldn't respond to other protests. I actually think those protests were really diverse in terms of what they were asking for. Like, when you look at them, they weren't necessarily, there were concerns around the like kind of level of bureaucracy that some of the green reforms could result in. But a lot of the complaints were actually about other farming related issues, which weren't to do with the climate at all. But I think essentially a seed that had been planted around those green farming laws that made them an easy target for politicians who wanted to kind of seem on side with the farming sector. Like, the decision to roll back a lot of those laws. I mean, so what we're talking about, I guess, is the EU farm to fork policy.
Trooper is a madness. It's a madness.
Which was kind of this big package of reforms that the EU agreed. The Parliament actually signed it off, but it was in the process of being translated into law in order to get farming in line with net zero goals. And so many of these laws have been kind of dropped, backtracked on recently, and particularly in the run up to that election. But I think basically what had happened was like lobby groups had been seeding that for so long. And, you know, we're not even talking about farming lobby groups. We're talking about like people like Bayer and Syngenta, you know, massive pesticide firms that have an extremely vested interest in pesticides continuing to be sold. Yeah. So I think essentially, in my view, what happened was the farming protests were really impactful, but the messaging of them was actually much more mixed than the media represented. And then this seed had already been sown for politicians to just wipe out green laws in response.
Interesting. That's really interesting. I suppose the protests provided sort of a good opportunity for, maybe infiltration's too much of a strong word, but an opportunistic sort of reaction from the right, from maybe conspiracy-minded individuals, from those with sort of more hidden divisive political agendas. They could kind of get involved in those protests and sort of play on those fears. And I wondered, were they kind of overrepresented then, because they're quite clickbaity, because they're quite sensationalist? Were they kind of overrepresented in the reporting around those farming protests?
Yeah, I think so.
Interesting.
I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I think there was a lot of strong reporting on the fact that the far right was trying to hijack these protests. Yeah. And, you know, far right parties in Germany kept showing up. Far right parties in the Netherlands kept showing up. You know, these politicians go and they pretend to be speaking for farmers. And part of what the media is doing is calling that out. Mm-hmm. But I do also think that there was definitely an overrepresentation of the like anti-climate sentiment that was there in some protests, but in a lot of countries wasn't the main concern.
Interesting. I always think of Nigel Farage turning up at inheritance tax protests. Oh, this is terrible. And this is the man who spearheaded Brexit, which was so hugely impactful to farmers.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's shameless. You know, you completely screw over an industry by pushing misinformation around about Brexit that then it impacts these farmers. And then you have the audacity to try and put on a Barber jacket and a flat cap and pretend you're a man of the people by being amongst these farmers. And it's just, it's kind of really shocking, but I suppose it does speak to the way they try and hijack political narratives or political moments to try and just kind of sow some seeds of doubt and kind of put this messaging into different bases and different demographics and see how it works within those ones as well. Mm-hmm. Do you think we'll see more of that?
Yes, it does seem like food and farming is ripe for it. And I think that, well, the really interesting thing that I think we're seeing, which is quite new to like the far right, is the level to which it's coordinated at the moment. Like a lot of what we do at DSMOG is kind of tracing these networks and the influence, say, of Trump think tanks in the US and the way that kind of people who are behind things like Project 2025 are bringing that ideas to Europe, collaborating with European partners in places like Hungary, seeding these things. So I think, you know, in the UK, we have potentially seen less of the conspiracy theories around food and farming and less of that divisiveness than in places like the Netherlands, potentially than in places like the US. But I think the
thing is, because we share a language, we get a lot of the American conspiracy slop just by default. Because it's very easy for people in the UK to interact with American media. So I don't think they necessarily have to be active here for us to get a lot of it by osmosis.
The level of coordination between the far right at the moment means that probably those ideas are just going to get propagated, particularly because they've been so successful. I mean, why wouldn't you replicate them?
It's true, isn't it? And I guess in the UK and in the US, because we have like a sort of a first past the post electoral system, also places, sometimes it places more power in the hands of sort of countryside communities, or in the US, states that are very agricultural states, but from a population perspective have far fewer people within them, but still getting the same number of Senate seats, for example, or overrepresented in the Electoral College. And I suppose these kinds of systems naturally lend themselves towards supporting more rural communities in many ways. And I guess that kind of makes their desires or their appeals or their wants sometimes more attractive to those trying to gain votes. And if that is the case, is there a risk that if farmers continue to become radicalized, or more farmers continue to become radicalized and start to believe in these right-wing beliefs or these conspiracy theories, will that shift the Overton window further and further to the right? Because to win votes, you'll have to appeal to these people, but their views and demands are becoming more extreme.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like we're already seeing the Overton window shifting. I feel like this is, in my view, where a lot of kind of centre, right wing, even left wing parties have really failed, is that they're trying to replicate the same narratives as the kind of far right parties who are taking votes away from him. You know, there's I don't know if you've heard of this, but there's this kind of principle in voting that the original will always do better than the replica.
Right.
So like, even if you say like, oh, we're as strong on immigration as reform, reform is then seen as the original, it will bolster them. You know, it actually doesn't work. And I think there's an issue, there's a risk, which is probably what we're seeing in Europe, but there's a risk that around things like climate, parties do that as well, that they see the far right getting votes, they replicate their talking points, they try and say that they're kind of up there as, you know, anti-net zero, whatever else, and in doing so they just legitimize them. They don't actually.
So true in deaf. Rural people thinking they're subsidising the cities more than the reverse, one of the most dangerous myths in every nation. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the less said about that, the better. You've nailed it.
Do you win any voters back?
Yeah, it's like we need that kind of, I don't want to say energy, but we need that kind of commitment to opposing ideals. We don't need centrist or left-wing parties trying to replicate the policies of the right. We need left-wing parties to have policies that oppose the right. We need them to have that sort of that binary so that people are given more choices and aren't going to feel like, why vote for the duplicate when we've got the original? Obviously, we've spoken a lot about some of the pushback. There's been a lot of pushback. We've spoken about some of the sort of the challenges that are faced and will continue to be faced probably for at least the near future. With that in mind, we've got a few minutes left. Maybe we try and end on something a little bit more positive. Are there things that can be done? Are there tactics or strategies that can be implemented? Essentially, is there anything that can be done to kind of cut through some of this pushback and to actually encourage these necessary changes to be brought about?
Yeah, it's a great question. I always hate questions on solutions.
Yeah, they're the hardest, aren't they? Yeah.
They're so hard. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think there's things we can do. I mean, I think some of it is around education. You know what, like we were saying right at the start, there is kind of a baseline understanding of the science around fossil fuels now, I think, in a way that there isn't around kind of methane and animal agriculture related emissions. So I think some of it is just that. But I also think that there is a huge amount that can be done to scrutinise and tackle the lobbying of these groups. You know, I guess as a journalist, some of it is things like investigating and exposing the bad faith actors and the networks that they run in. But I also think there's a lot around kind of transparency laws, how lobbying is regulated, advertising standards, like we were talking about, you know, trying to cut out some of this kind of misleading messaging and trying to resettle the balance in who's influencing politics around things like food and farming.
Yeah, I think there's probably a number of different ways of approaching it, and it's not just like this one track mind politics or whatever it might be. There's a number of different ways of approaching this, and they will all have benefits in different ways and add up to something to something more generally that's positive. And actually, if we tie it right back to what we were talking about at the beginning, the Lancet report, obviously there was a huge amount of pushback against it, especially in terms of how it was represented in the media. But scientifically and academically, it's actually been very positive and very influential and has been cited thousands of times. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, it's been cited.
Yeah, that's a really fair comment. The most visible thing to, you know, the average Twitter user is going to be the sensationalist backlash, the conspiracies, the articles seeded by PR firms and so on. But in the scientific community, you know, barring Frederick Leroy and the Dublin Declaration crowd, who have their own version of reality going on, it seems, the people who actually understand the science understand that we need to reduce our consumption of animal products. So to the extent that science continues to be done robustly, and again, that's That's not all science, right? It's going to be, you do have your Frederick Leroy's and your Frank Mitlohners and your unscientific pro-meat scientists, quote-unquote scientists. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Lancet report is very mainstream science and is accepted and well cited in the scientific community. So yeah,
9,000 times in academic literature. It's one of the most widely used papers in terms of policy decisions. So, you know, some of this is having cut through. It just feels like there's this disjoint, doesn't there, between kind of public and science, and and it's how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, I suppose there is, because as sort of consumers or as social media users, we see what's happening on that level. We see the sort of the conversation that exists there. But from policy perspectives, from legislative perspectives, we're not necessarily involved in that. We don't see what's happening. We don't see the conversations that are occurring, the small little changes, the little micro movements that are occurring behind the scenes. And we just kind of see like often the bad stuff. But there is this positive influence that scientific literature is having. The Lancet report's a big one. And they're about to release an updated one this year, is it?
They are, yeah. I think towards the kind of end of this year, there'll be another one coming out.
And, you know, hopefully they'll be better prepared. And, you know, it allows them to kind of expand on that. And, you know, there's another opportunity for something that...
Yeah, the you know, backlash to the second Lancet report has been much more timid. I guess that they did not get the same PR agency this time around. And perhaps the Lancet people were a bit more well prepared for it as well. But yeah, there's much less for people to complain about. Or I shouldn't say less for people to complain about. There's much less complaining in the newer Lancet report, which is a good thing.
It'll actually be really influential in years to come, hopefully. Thank you so much, Claire, for joining me. I really appreciate it. And I've had a really great time speaking with you, even though the conversation hasn't always been about topics that are fun. It's been really enjoyable to sort of pick your brain and to delve into these topics. So I appreciate you for coming and spending an hour or so with me and talking through these things.
No, it's great. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. All right. Well,
cool.
Thanks so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And I will speak to all of you in the next episode. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. Just a reminder that my third book, How to Go and Stay Vegan, is now available to pre-order, and links to do so can be found in the description below, where you'll also find a link to my Substack, where I'm posting weekly articles. All right, thank you so much again for watching, and I look forward to seeing all of you in the next video.
Awesome. What a champ. And thank you all so much for watching. That is going to be me for today. Yeah, thank you, Ed. Thank you. Truly. Thank you for tuning in, guys. Nice little Saturday afternoon stream today. I will be back. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe do a little stream tomorrow. We'll see. Or certainly next week. I appreciate you guys tuning in. We didn't manage to get the Twitch stream working this time around, so YouTube remains where it's at. I did stream a multi-stream a little bit to Facebook and to LinkedIn, which is of course where it's truly at. But YouTube, crowd of the OGs, appreciate you in depth, appreciate you Poe, Race Lever. Good to see you guys. And yeah, true, Ed is a vegan 1.99. You know, I hadn't yet come up with vegan 2.0 when I spoke to Ed, which is a big regret. Otherwise, I could have mentioned it on his podcast. But we'll see. That episode's going to come out soon. True, Race Lever. Grow my hair out and start calling myself Earthling Chris. Then maybe my viewers will go off a little bit. Hey. All right. I appreciate you guys tuning in. And I will catch you next stream. Cheers.